When one talks about quality of life, believe me, one thinks about the friends, the colleagues, and the loved ones that are here in this audience tonight. And to each of you whom we've had the pleasure over the years of coming and sharing and learning together, drinking a lot of wine and having fun, we say muchas gracias. It's been good, and it will continue to be good. In 1995, 21 years ago, almost to the day, we met in this room and we talked about people with intellectual disability. And we talked about their lives. And we talked about how can their lives be improved. And I think what you've heard in part this evening is the tremendous changes that have occurred during that 20-year period. And just for interest, how many of you were here sitting in these god-awfully uncomfortable benches in 1995? Yeah, absolutely. But that's good news and bad news. The good news is we're here to raise our hand. And the bad news is many of you have missed the wonderful journey that many of us have had over those 20 years. We're here tonight to really celebrate not just INICO, but I think to realize what INICO is. And my suggestion to you is that INICO is not a place. INICO is indeed not a building. And in a real sense, INICO is not a group of people. INICO is an idea. It's an idea that was formulated here by a group of wonderful people and has been implemented by a group of wonderful people. And it's a very simple idea. The idea is that we can make a change in people's lives. To make that change, we have to think differently. We have to think differently, as Mark so eloquently described, how people with intellectual disability are viewed. But we also need to think very creatively about how we can be instrumental in changing the conditions under which they live, changing the attitudes of people who associate with them, but maybe most importantly, changing how we ourselves think about not just their potential, but our potential. So we're here tonight to celebrate INICO's 20th anniversary. But we're also here to think about the future. And what I would like to do in the few minutes that I have, and I guarantee you we will not be late, is to talk about 5 factors or trends, if you wish, that I think are going to make a big difference in the lives of individuals with intellectual disability, but also in our own lives. Now, I've listed there for you what those 5 trends are. And because the hour is late, because your bottoms are getting tired, and as a teacher I learned a long time ago that you never give people's heads more than their bottoms will take. And so what I want to do, did you get that? Good. What I want to do is to go through these 5 trends and give you, not word for word, but really the essence of the ideas reflected in these trends. So that when you walk out of here tonight, you can get the facts. These slides are going to be on the web, so you can pull them down. But what I want you to do is to take away, in reference to each of these 5 trends or factors, sort of the key idea. And the key idea of this first practice is in reference to the value-based policies and practices, is why is that important? Why have we stressed so much in all the work that all of us have done over the last decade or two? Value-based. Because it's the values that we place on people that determine how we deal with people. To the degree that individuals with intellectual disability are devalued, the services and supports they receive will be of little value. And so the importance of having a real strong commitment to value-based policies and practices is that they drive what we do. They drive what politicians do. They drive what parents feel and think. But most important, my friends, is it drives what the person with a disability thinks. To the degree that the individual with a disability feels as though he or she is respected, to the degree to which he or she feels that they have the same rights that you and I have, to the degree that they indeed have the same opportunities that you and I have, they will feel much more like you and me. And I would suggest to you that that is the most important part of a value-based approach. We could spend a long time on this, and Mark made reference to it briefly. I think a second major factor that you will be addressing, that the field will be addressing, is to think in terms of multidimensionality. And by that, I'm simply talking about the fact that when you look at human functioning, it is a multidimensional phenomenon. A person with intellectual disabilities is not just a person with intellectual disabilities. And so in time, we have expanded a single approach or dimension of behavior to a multidimensional approach. So we talk about these 5 dimensions that you see in front of you. We talk about intellectual functioning. We talk about adaptive behavior. We talk about health and participation and context. And the importance of thinking that way in terms of multidimensionality is that that begins to shape what you do in terms of diagnosing, in terms of assessment, in terms of classifying people on the basis of the multidimensionality of behavior as opposed to a singular way to classify people in terms of intelligence. Now, the third trend is one that you've heard a lot about from the individuals who spoke initially, and Mark, and McGill, obviously. And that is, the future will be characterized by best practices. Now, best practices is an evolving issue. And the one that I want to focus on the most is the one called planning supports. As we think about what are the best practices in terms of planning supports, we have to begin with the idea of what are the individual goals of that person. Not what the disability is, not what the limitations are, not what the maladaptive behavior is, but what are the personal goals of people? And then also, obviously, what are their support needs? If you begin from that point in your ISP or IEP or any service plan process, if you begin with the premise that whatever you do with the person should be based upon that individual's personal goals and assess support needs, you're going to end up in a very different place than if you begin the process focusing on the individual's defect. And so our challenge is to realize that supports are provided for a reason, and that is to enhance that individual's quality of life, but that person's quality of life, as yours and mine, is intricately related to what our personal goals are. If we're doing the kinds of things that we want to do, our quality of life is much better. If we're doing the things that people tell us we need to do, you know what we're going to tell those people to do, right? Javier, can you get that into Spanish? The second part of planning supports is something that you will be facing and grappling with because it's a very profound point. And that is that as you think about planning support, you need to incorporate what's called the capabilities approach. This is a fundamental movement that is occurring today. And what that movement says essentially is this. It's very simple, yet profound. That everyone has capabilities. And that what we need to do is to build on those capabilities. Now, some of those capabilities may be more limited than others, but there is no one that does not have capabilities. But here's the kicker, and it's a very important kicker, my friends, that no one should be denied opportunities because of a lack of ability. There should not be a litmus test for opportunities, because people will never benefit from opportunities that they've never had. And one of the serious challenges that we've addressed over the 20 years that we have worked jointly in quality of life is to convince people that quality of life is really a universal phenomenon. Or as I usually say, quality of life is quality of life. And that individuals who may be the most profoundly impacted by their disability, that may have the most severe limitations that you can envision, still have a quality of life. And it's dependent on each of us to then try to determine how best to not just assess that quality of life, but to enhance it. So the capabilities approach is a key idea that I hope each of you, as you walk out of here tonight, keep in the back of your mind. Because a challenge for each of us in the future is opportunity development for individuals. Because remember the basic dictum that you cannot benefit from an opportunity that you've never had. Now, as we move on to the next challenge, trend, and factor, is evidence-based decision making. You're all aware, I'm sure, of the concept of evidence-based practices. And my best guess is that that concept of evidence-based will continue to grow in importance. You're seeing it already in national policies, local policies. You're seeing it in terms of accreditation of programs, of licensing of programs, and that is that decision making is based on evidence. It's not based upon intuition. Now, that presents a challenge to those of you who are going to be our future leaders. Because in order to have evidence, you have to determine what is evidence in a very reliable and valid way. So I would challenge each of you who are doing research or services is to ask yourself on any given day, as you do whatever you do, am I using not just best practices as a profession or society tells me, but do I have evidence that what I'm doing makes a difference in that person's life? Because it's when we come to that point in time that we can see that there is a close relationship between what we do and the effect that it produces. Then we have not just moved into the realm and the world and the era of evidence-based practices, but we have also entered into a much more effective world in terms of showing how well we do what we do. So keep in mind and walk out of this door based upon the concept of evidence-based decision making. And make your decisions based upon best evidence and not so much on intuition. I get most excited probably when I talk about the fifth trend, and I won't take a lot of our time, because I think where we are in sort of our evolution in intellectual disability is focused on this trend or this factor. And that is, I think we are at the point, or to the point, where we can now seriously consider developing an integrated theory of intellectual disability, which has never been done. And you might ask, well, why is a theory of intellectual disability so important? Well, why is Einstein's theory of relativity so important? In other words, if you have a theory, you're much better able to understand a phenomenon. You're much better able to explain how and why that phenomenon, that is intellectual disability, functions as it does, but you can also make predictions. So for the next 5 minutes, we're all going to be minor Einsteins. I appreciate the fact that Miguel quoted Einstein in his last slide, because I think what that slide tells us, told me at least, is I think it's time for a good theory of intellectual disability. So what does a theory really amount to? Well, it starts with a conceptual model, and I'll give you that model here in a few moments. But then there are three components. You all ready for 1, 2, 3? There's a definitional component, there's an explanatory component, and then, as you see, there is a predictive component. And what I'd like to have you do, if you would, bear with me now, what I'd like to have you do, if you would, is to see the relevance of these components of a theory. So, our conceptual model is one that is well recognized and, as Mark indicated, really aligned among the ICD-11, the American Psychiatric Association, and DSM-5, and AEIDD in our work. And there are really two aspects to this conceptual model, or three, sort of 2.5 aspects. It's characterized by, as you can see there, the functional limitations that relate to intellectual functioning, adaptive behavior, and the age of onset is during the developmental period. So that's the characteristic of intellectual disability. That's also, as we're going to see, the definitional component in our theory. It's expressed in reference to the whole area of human factors and human dimensions. And so as you look then at its characteristic, and then it's expressed in the way that these multi-dimensions, these 5 dimensions that I mentioned, interact with one another. And then the half a component here is the last part of this statement, that indeed with appropriate individualized supports over time, the life functioning of individuals with intellectual disability will improve. So that's our conceptual model. Okay on that? Definitionally, you see the definition, which is the characteristic of intellectual disability. It's this next 3 slides that I hope you pay special attention to. Are you ready? All right, good. Because when you get into the explanatory component simply explains the causative factors and clarifies what is the impact of the construct that is intellectual disability. And here there are 2 things that I really, really, really want you to think about. And that is, the causative factors are risk factors. And they're explained by really a very huge area of research, a very huge area of application, and it's called the multifactorial model of etiology. And what that means is that when you look at the etiology, the cause of intellectual disability, what you see is that there are multiple causes. And these multiple causes are referred to as risk factors. Now note that the risk factors can be divided into the types of factors and the timing of factors. So consequently, if you look at the types of factors, you have the biomedical, which we on a daily basis are understanding more about. They certainly are the social. The vast majority of individuals with intellectual disability, by the way, are that way because of social cultural factors. The vast majority. So that's a huge risk factor. If you grow up in poverty, or if you grow up in an area in which language is minimized, or any other causal factors, you have an extremely high risk of becoming labeled or diagnosed as intellectually disabled. But here are two that you sometimes don't think about in terms of risk factors. Education is a risk factor. And to the degree that we prevent or inhibit or disallow kids with intellectual disability from having an appropriate educational environment, that is causing the intellectual disability. It's a risk factor. But you also have the behavioral side. Behavioral in terms of maternal behavior, for example. The kinds of behaviors that you see in early childhood in reference to encouraging language. And there have been some fascinating studies done looking simply at how many words are people with intellectual disability hearing per day during their first year of life versus the number of words that a child without intellectual disability are hearing in a given day. And it's astronomical. The difference is phenomenal. And so behavior in terms of simply language and language usage and language familiarity is a huge risk factor in terms of intellectual disability. So we have the types of factors, but we also have the timing of factors. We have, as you know, we have the prenatal, the perinatal, and the postnatal. And so as we become more sophisticated, as we become more inclusive in terms of what we do in prenatal care, in perinatal care, and in postnatal care, the lesser will be the incidence of intellectual disability. So it's important to understand that the risk factors are factors that we can do something about. Now, as you see here, the second component is that how do those factors work? What happens? How do they produce their effect? And indeed, they produce the functional limitations. Now, the future, there we go, okay? The functional limitations are going to be produced by these risk factors. And it's this last part of the slide that I think is really important. That these risk factors that produce the functional limitations, these are what we can then ameliorate in reference to the mitigation or the lessening of one's intellectual disability. So finally we come then to the third component, which is the predictive component. And even though it's easy to talk about the predictive component, the beautiful thing about having a theory is it generates hypotheses, right? And so you can begin to test hypotheses that stem from your theory. And if, for example, one hypothesis is that intellectual disability is increased by these risk factors, then our hypothesis is if we lessen the risk factors, we should lessen the intellectual disability. So that consequently the prediction is that we should be able to mitigate, to lessen the impact of the intellectual disability if we understand what causes it and if we understand the impact that that condition has upon the individual's functional limitations. Okay? let me conclude with just a couple of thoughts. And what I'd like to do is to conclude first with a statement about our journey that we've had together. And secondly, I would like to conclude, as I typically do, with a challenge. In terms of the journey that we have taken, it's been a phenomenal journey over these 20 years. It's been a journey that each of us, each of you, have been a part of in very important ways. It's a journey in which we have learned a tremendous amount about not just people with intellectual disability, but I think we've also learned a great deal about ourselves in the process. It's a journey that we have taken and that we have learned that people's lives can be changed. That people indeed have the potential to be other than they are if they receive the same kind of support and encouragement. It's a journey that I think has been very important to each of us, because what we've been able to do in that journey is to combine science with a social philosophy. And that is that those are not incompatible. In other words, you can do good science on the basis of good philosophy and good social science. It's been a journey that has been very productive. It's been a journey that has been challenging. But you know, there's a statement in Chinese. The Chinese have a beautiful statement in which they say, at the end of it all, the journey is the reward. And for all those of you who have been on that journey, I think we all sense that what we have done and will continue to do has been to make a difference in people's lives. And that in and of itself is a tremendous, tremendous reward. And finally, I want to challenge you. For the last 20 years, INICO has indeed been a beacon, a national beacon and an international beacon, for understanding better intellectual disability, for helping people understand that there are ways to effectively help people to experience more opportunities and enhance quality of life. And it's also been a beacon in terms of best practices. Best practices in terms of assessment, best practices in terms of application, and best practices in terms of professional development. And here's the challenge. Each of you needs to be a beacon. You need to be a beacon that you can use INICO as an example, that really reflects upon what quality of life is all about. You need a beacon that tells people and encourages people and shows people what are best practices. You need to be a beacon in terms of mentoring individuals who are going to also make a difference in people's lives. But you need to be a beacon also in terms of changing the world. So my hope is, my anticipation is, that you'll each be a beacon. And my hope is that it's a strong beacon and it's an enduring beacon. Muchas gracias.